yin between blindness and exposure. It is the early hours of February 8, 1945, and along the German border near the Reichswald Forest, more than 1,000 Allied guns are about to open fire in the largest concentration of artillery the Western Front has yet seen. Men of XXX Corps crouch in flooded ditches, faces blackened, waiting for the signal that will launch Operation Veritable into the teeth of the German defenses. The night is total. No stars, no moon. Low winter cloud presses down over the Rhineland like a lid, and a soldier here could not see his own boots, let alone the man beside him. Then, somewhere behind the lines, a switch is thrown. Banks of searchlights, the same instruments that once hunted German bombers over English cities, swivel upward. Instead of stabbing out across the horizon, their beams climb almost vertically and strike the underside of the cloud. The effect is immediate and strange. The sky does not light up so much as soften, taking on a pale, shadowless glow, as though dawn has arrived hours early and from the wrong direction. Troops moving up to their start lines can suddenly make out the man in front, the edge of a track, the silhouette of a tank. The Germans across the line, looking up, see only a sourceless brightness with nothing to aim at. Men who have spent the war learning to fear light, learning that a struck match or a careless headlamp can bring down German shell fire, now find themselves standing in a pale glow that reveals their friends but somehow not their exact position. Engineers checking bridging equipment can read the markings on a crate without a torch. Drivers can pick out the edge of a track rather than guessing at it in the dark. A few hundred meters away, the enemy looks up at that same glow and sees only an empty, sourceless sky. British soldiers have a name for it already, half joking, half in awe. Monty's Moonlight. What is happening over the Reichswald that night is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It fires no shells and kills no one directly, but it solves a problem that had haunted commanders since armies first tried to fight after dark. The problem of how to see without being seen, how to move thousands of men and vehicles through total darkness without losing them to confusion, collision, or chance. By 1945, the British Army had found an answer so simple in concept and so strange in execution that it still surprises people today. Namely, that if the moon will not cooperate, you build your own. This is the story of how the Royal Artillery turned the most ordinary tool of air defense, the humble searchlight, into a means of manufacturing moonlight on demand, bright enough to guide an army, soft enough not to betray it, and reliable enough to use on the worst nights of the worst winter of the war. To understand why this mattered, you first have to understand what night actually meant to an army in 1944. Darkness was both a shield and a trap. A night attack offered surprise. Troops could close on an enemy position before the defenders knew they were coming, and aircraft could not strafe what their pilots could not see. But that same darkness was just as dangerous to the attacker. Columns of lorries and tanks routinely lost their way on unfamiliar roads. Engineers building bridges under fire had to work half-blind, fumbling with explosive charges and cable by touch. Infantry crossing open ground in the bocage country of Normandy or the flooded polders of the Netherlands could walk in entirely the wrong direction without a single landmark to fix on. Existing solutions were poor compromises at best. Flares and very lights could mark a position for a few seconds, but they burned out fast, gave away exactly where the firer was standing, and ruined whatever night vision the troops had built up. Natural moonlight was unreliable by definition. A full moon appeared for only a handful of nights each month, and commanders often deliberately chose the darkest nights for an attack precisely because a bright moon exposed advancing troops to German observers and aircraft. That left the worst of both worlds. Night attacks planned for maximum surprise were, by design, fought in conditions where soldiers could barely see their own hands. There was an irony in all this that planners understood well. The Luftwaffe had spent years choosing nights with a full or near-full moon to guide its bombers onto British cities, a period crews grimly called the bomber's moon, precisely because moonlight made navigation and target finding easier from the air. For ground troops, that same moonlight was a liability rather than an asset. lighting them up for German artillery observers and aircraft alike. The two demands canceled each other out. The nights bright enough to see by were also the nights most dangerous to be seen in, leaving commanders forever choose. The weather of Northwest Europe made the problem worse still. The autumn and winter of 1944 into 1945 brought some of the wettest, most overcast conditions of the war, with low cloud blotting out what moonlight there was on most nights anyway. Roads dissolved into mud. The close, hedge-walled fields of the Normandy bocage swallowed up entire platoons who lost their bearings after dark, while river crossings at the Seine, the Maas, and eventually the Rhine had to be planned and executed in conditions where a wrong step off a duckboard could mean drowning, and a stalled vehicle in a narrow lane could jam an entire division's advance for hours. Commanders needed troops to move with the confidence of daylight while keeping the concealment of night, two qualities that, on paper, simply could not coexist. The idea that eventually solved it was not, in truth, brand new. As early as the First World War, gunners had noticed that searchlight beams angled up into low clouds scattered back down as a faint, even glow, a trick used occasionally to assist night attacks on the Western Front. It had then been largely forgotten, filed away as a curiosity of static trench warfare. It took the mobile, fast-moving campaigns of 1944 to revive it, and the men who did so belonged to Britain's Anti-Aircraft Command, units of the Royal Artillery whose searchlights had spent the early war years hunting Luftwaffe bombers over British cities during the Blitz. From July 1944, 3 independent searchlight batteries, the 344th, 356th, and 474th, began experimenting with their standard mobile 90-centimeter projectors, the same lorry-mounted units used for home defense, to see whether the old cloud bounce trick could be made reliable enough for routine battlefield use. Rather than pointing the beam horizontally at an aircraft, crews angled it almost straight up, letting the cloud base act as an enormous natural diffuser. The principle is not far removed from a photographer bouncing a flash off a white ceiling rather than firing it straight at a subject's face. The light spreads, softens, and loses its single, blinding point of origin, arriving instead as gentle, even illumination from everywhere and nowhere at once. The equipment itself was a study in raw, brute force engineering wrapped around a fairly delicate optical idea. A standard wartime anti-aircraft searchlight used a carbon arc lamp, essentially 2 rods of carbon with a current arcing between them, generating light at the heart of a large parabolic mirror, often rhodium-plated to maximize reflectivity. The bigger, fixed home defense projectors, with mirrors around 150 centimeters across, could throw a beam visible on a clear night at distances of 45 to 56 kilometers, drawing on generators in the region of 15 kilowatts, roughly 10 times the supply running into an ordinary household. The mobile 90-centimeter units used for movement light were smaller and built for towing behind a lorry rather than fixed emplacement, trading some raw power for the mobility needed to keep pace with an advancing army. Exact output figures for these field units were not the sort of thing the Army committed to paper for enemy benefit, so direct comparisons remain necessarily approximate. Keeping these units running in the field was its own quiet logistical battle. Carbon arc lamps burned through their carbon rods steadily, and as searchlight troops scattered themselves thinly across an advancing front, sometimes a single section attached to one division while others supported entirely different formations miles away, battery headquarters and the attached Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers workshops found themselves stretched simply keeping every detachment supplied with fresh rods and servicing the radar sets used to lay the beams accurately. It was an unglamorous problem, more akin to running a delivery network than fighting a battle, but it mattered just as much as the optics. A searchlight with no carbon left to burn was just an expensive lump of mirrored glass. By early 1945, ahead of the Reichswald offensive, officers of 31st North Midland Anti-Aircraft Brigade ran deliberate experiments in Belgium to refine the technique properly, working out how to use the light not only to guide friendly movement, but also to floodlight enemy objectives and dazzle defenders staring back across no man's land. That same winter, gunners of the 557th Searchlight Battery, serving under 1st Canadian Army, pushed the idea further still, mounting a searchlight directly onto a turretless Canadian ram tank, with its generator carried inside a second tank following close behind. It gave the light source armor and tracks of its own, able to move up with the infantry rather than waiting safely in the rear. Curiously, the men experimenting with this armored approach seem to have had no idea that a related but entirely separate and far more secret program already existed elsewhere in the British Army. Tank-mounted searchlights designed years earlier as an offensive, dazzling weapon in their own right, developed under such tight secrecy that even fellow searchlight specialists working on movement light had never heard of them. The technique earned its keep in a string of unglamorous but vital operations through the second half of 1944. On July 9th, 6 detachments from 474 Battery lit the forward assembly areas for the 43rd Wessex Division as it moved up for the brutal fighting around Hill 112 in Operation Jupiter, and did the same 3 days later for the 53rd Welsh Division. In mid-July, during Operation Greenline, drivers of the 15th Scottish Division later said the light had been a genuine help in picking a route along a potholed, dust-choked track they could otherwise barely make out. During Operation Market Garden in September, troops provided lighting for engineers bridging the Wilhelmina Canal at Soane as XXX Corps pushed toward Eindhoven, while elsewhere on the same operation, other sections lit the vital traffic routes feeding the corridor north towards Nijmegen, even as a third element took up conventional anti-aircraft positions defending the bridge at Grave. At Nijmegen itself, that autumn, searchlights swept the river as well as the sky, guarding the vital bridges against German frogmen attempting to plant demolition charges in the dark. In November, troops of the 51st Highland Division used movement light for the first time to cover an assault crossing of the Afwatering Canal and the River Maas, the same detachment staying on a second night to illuminate the repair of the bridge it had helped them take, before being moved again, losing several vehicles in the mud along the way to light a difficult night advance into Nederweert under enemy shell fire. Through the same winter, other sections rotated back into straightforward anti-aircraft duty around Geleen and Maastricht, defending the Maas bridges against renewed German air activity as the Ardennes offensive raged to the south, a reminder that movement light crews were never far from their original wartime trade. British searchlight crews even lent their skills to American troops, supporting the 84th U.S. Infantry Division's attack on Geilenkirchen that November. What is harder to document is how German troops on the receiving end actually experienced it. Most surviving accounts come from British and Canadian unit diaries rather than from the men staring up, baffled, into that strange, unmoonlit glow. If you are enjoying this dive into one of the war's stranger technical footnotes, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep finding stories like it. It is worth setting this British approach against what others attempted with searchlights in the same war. The basic optics were nothing exotic. German air defense units operated broadly similar equipment, and there is little evidence the Wehrmacht ever organized an equivalent dedicated illumination arm for ground operations, even though the original cloud bounce trick had first been noticed during the First World War and was, in principle, available to any army willing to experiment with it. The British also explored other, very different uses for the same basic technology around the same period, fitting searchlights into the noses of converted night fighter aircraft and beneath the wings of submarine hunting bombers, though neither of those applications had much to do with lighting a path for friendly ground troops, and both were eventually overtaken by radar. The most striking contrast comes instead from the Soviet Red Army, which used searchlights very differently during the assault on the Seelow Heights in April 1945. There, some 143 searchlights were aimed directly at the German defense lines, intended to dazzle the defenders in the opening moments of the Berlin offensive, launched behind the heaviest artillery bombardment the war had yet seen. It did not work as planned. Morning fog scattered the beams and threw the advancing Soviet troops into sharp silhouette instead, making them easier targets for the Germans rather than harder ones, contributing to heavy losses and a costly delay. The British technique, by deliberately bouncing light off cloud rather than firing it horizontally at the enemy, avoided exactly that trap. It lit friendly troops from above rather than outlining them from behind, and it was used, with only the occasional disruption from shelling or mortar fire on the searchlight positions themselves, across months of operations without a comparable disaster. The Americans never developed an equivalent organic capability of their own, relying instead on British searchlight troops when the need arose, as at Geilenkirchen, which says something about how specifically British and Canadian this innovation remained within the wider Allied war effort. Quantifying the precise impact of artificial moonlight is genuinely difficult, and honest history has to admit it. There are no clean statistics comparing casualty rates or schedule delays with and without it. What survives are unit war diaries describing smoother river crossings, fewer vehicles lost to ditches and collisions, and infantry who reported finding their way more easily through ground they could otherwise barely make out. The psychological dimension may matter as much as the practical one. Light removing the particular, disorientating fear of moving blind through contested ground for the troops using it, while offering the enemy nothing solid to shoot at. By February 1945, the technique had proven itself enough that 5 searchlight batteries were formally redesignated Moonlight batteries, an official acknowledgement, in the dry language of military reorganization, that this had become a recognized arm of the battle rather than an improvised trick. One of the original pioneering units, the 344th, was even large enough to be split in two, forming a second dedicated Moonlight battery alongside it. The RAM tank-mounted searchlights pointed toward a future of mobile, armored battlefield illumination, while some accounts suggest that a version of the role persisted within the post-war British Army for decades afterwards under unit names like Movement Light Squadrons, though detailed records from that later period are thin, and the claim deserves to be treated with appropriate caution rather than stated as settled fact. Surviving hardware from the wartime units is scarce. Much of this story exists today in regimental histories, war diaries, and the records of bodies such as the Royal Artillery's own historical trust, rather than in glass cases, with only scattered examples of period searchlight equipment preserved in British military heritage collections. Perhaps the most vivid account of what this technology could achieve comes not from the Reichswald, but from later that spring, during the crossing of the river Elbe near Artlenburg in April 1945. The sky that night was so heavily overcast that the entire program of air support planned for the following morning had to be scrapped outright, and yet the movement light, bounced off that same thick cloud from searchlights positioned well behind the line, was bright enough that men standing unseen in the shadows near Artlenburg could make out almost nothing of the land around them, only the surface of the Elbe itself, glowing as though it had been set alight from beneath, with the enemy bank lost somewhere in the dark beyond it. That image, an army's borrowed moonlight glittering on a river while genuine night swallows everything else, is as good a summary as any of what this peculiar piece of British wartime ingenuity actually achieved. It did not blast a path through German defenses. It did not end the war by itself. What it did was quieter and, in its way, just as remarkable. It took the oldest, most unanswerable obstacle a soldier faces, the simple fact that the sun goes down, and refused to accept it as fixed. No moon on the calendar. The Army manufactured one anyway. No stars to steer by. Gunners turned an instrument built to find enemy bombers into one that guided friendly tanks. No guarantee the sky would cooperate. Engineers learned to bend even thick winter cloud into something useful. There is something quietly very British about the whole affair. No single brilliant inventor stepped forward to claim it. No press conference announced it. It grew, instead, out of 3 ordinary searchlight batteries tinkering with kit they already had, out of a brigade headquarters running careful trials in a Belgian field, out of gunners and engineers solving a practical problem because the problem was in front of them and the war would not wait for a tidier answer. It earned its nickname not from a planning document, but from the soldiers who used it, half affectionate, half astonished that anyone had thought to try.